At the time of filming this, although most certainly long before my time of actually uploading this video, I am saying goodbye pretty soon to a very interesting part of my collection. This is a horn that I found on eBay for surprisingly cheap thanks to a tip-off from a good friend, and I didn't do much with it in my time having the horn. That made me feel a little bad, and I figured somebody else could probably put it to better use. But this is a really interesting piece of history, hailing to us from 101 years ago. Let's talk about it. How's it going, everybody? It's your host Sam here from the Samuel Plays Brass channel as per usual. I hope you're doing well, and I appreciate you tuning in. This is going to be a fun video, if not a little bit more of an informal one, more of a show and tell rather than a down-to-business review. But this is a really cool instrument that I figured would have a nice place on the channel before I sell it, so let's take a look. We're going to start off here with the case, which we'll see says the Boston Musical Instrument Company. That is indeed who made this instrument. We've got some latches here that say Eagle Lock Company, USA, Terryville, Connecticut. I don't know my geography well enough. I think that's what that says, but it's just a little bit faded. Let's open this thing up. So here we have a nice green velvet-lined case. Once again, I'm going to be very careful here so the horn doesn't fall out. But once again, we have the Boston logo up top there, if you flip it upside down. So this trumpet, once again, was made by the Boston Musical Instrument Company, as evidenced by the bell. It is a 3-star model, as evidenced by the fact that there are 3 stars on the bell. And it is considered the Model 11, I believe. The serial number dates it back to 1923, which is pretty sweet. We just missed its centennial. Now, what I'm going to be consulting here is a book called A Timeline of Trumpets, written actually by the very same friend who tipped me off about this instrument and told me that I should review it on the channel. So he's got some decent information about the Boston Company here, and specifically I want to start off by looking at what looks like a snapshot out of a Boston brochure that talks about the specifications of the Boston 3-star trumpet. We'll note a couple of things that they say. They say the metal is hand-hammered, best trumpet brass, whatever that means. It was made in 3 bores, small, medium, large, which are detailed later on. What I'll note is that the valve casing, just under the serial number, says number 1 on this trumpet, so I assume that means small bore, which says adaptable for dance and light orchestra work. The weight is 2 pounds, 7.5 ounces, length 21 3/4 inches. And it says the bell diameter is 4.5 inches. I measured it out as 4 7/16, just under 4.5, but probably not the biggest difference in the world. It says built in B flat with quick invisible change to A, which I'll demonstrate here. This one is made in low pitch, so it barely sneaks up to A equals 440, because low pitch at the time was something like A equals 436 hertz, but nonetheless, it does get up there, depending on your mouthpiece choice, more or less up to pitch. It also notes that the instrument can be played in C without additional attachments, which we will later demonstrate as well. We've got some characteristic features here: short, light valve action, convenient position of second valve slide, preventing collection of water. That's opposed to the second slide that faces the other way and unfortunately causes water to trickle down into it if you have a below horizontal bell angle. It says movable slide on third valve with adjustable finger ring to enable player to tune while playing. On this particular model, with everything else being exquisite, unfortunately the alignment on the third slide is quite off, so I was not able to adjust it very effectively while playing. It also says perfect balance of weight when suspended by third valve, which is pretty neat. Ease of blowing in all register. Notes won't crack when overblown. Maybe that was true of the time and compared to other trumpets of that era, but that's actually one of the biggest drawbacks of these old trumpets. That wonderful trumpet tone, characteristic of the Boston, which I will talk more about later. And the metal of the bell is hand-hammered, and blah, 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 blah. Yep, more on that kind of stuff. Now, the reason I make that snide remark about the supposed characteristic trumpet sound of Boston trumpets is because the Boston Company was essentially just a cornet manufacturer. They were trying to make trumpet designs starting in the late 1800s, but the author notes these were basically just rewrapped, elongated cornets. They really didn't have universal market appeal as trumpets. And so this was really not the Boston Company's wheelhouse. Something I realized I forgot as I was packing up the instrument was the fact that it came with this cornet to trumpet mouthpiece receiver. So just another indication of Boston's focus on cornet design over trumpet design. They would literally let you use a cornet mouthpiece with their instrument. Nonetheless, I think it's a cool horn, but it is interesting that they really were not known for their trumpets. In fact, these trumpets appear to be pretty close clones of the Vega Power model and Chas E. George model. There's a picture in this book of a George model in small bore that looks very, very similar to what we're looking at here today. And there are also some pictures of Boston trumpets that came a little bit later. First of all, there's a picture of a 3-star Model 11, which should be essentially what I have, that does indeed look very similar. The one key difference I would note between this raw brass Model 11 and what I'm looking at today is the lead pipe, and we'll go over more of that later. But on the following page, there's a picture of supposedly another 1923 Boston trumpet. This one differs not only at the lead pipe, but in the third slide construction. That looks quite different to me. And then there's a picture of a 1925 Boston, by which point quite a number of things had changed. And something fun to note about this trumpet's supposed Vega George model origins is that the mouthpiece that was supplied with it is actually a Chas E. George Boston No. 2. It's not in very good shape. There's quite a lot of plating missing on the rim, and I did not play on it very much as a result. It also was just generally too tight for me to play on, very flat rim, pretty small inner diameter. It just lacked focus in its sound generally, so I really didn't do much with it. But nonetheless, it's interesting that a Chas E. George mouthpiece would be supplied with a Boston trumpet, unless it were the case that Boston trumpets were essentially rebranded Vegas. Now that's about all I've got for you in terms of history, so let's take a look at some of the features of this instrument. First things first, we're going to start on the mouthpiece end of things, and the reason I mentioned lead pipes when talking about the pictures of Boston trumpets in a timeline of trumpets is that this one is quite different, and it's not one you see very often. Normally, on a trumpet lead pipe, we have a mouthpiece receiver sleeve of about that length, maybe a little longer, a little shorter, depending on the exact brand, soldered onto the rest of the lead pipe. And that was the case for those photos. All we have here is this little insert soldered straight into the lead pipe, which goes for that long. That is highly unusual. I rarely ever see something like this, but this trumpet technically doesn't have a mouthpiece receiver. You just insert the mouthpiece into the lead pipe, which kind of tightens up here and then starts expanding again. Really, really strange. Not the way I would do things, that's for sure. Also worth noting about the lead pipe is that the original, or similar to original, mouthpiece fits in decently far, but not quite as far as you would expect. But this is also a slightly smaller than modern shank. If you try and take a modern trumpet mouthpiece, it actually barely inserts into there. And granted, I really didn't want to play on the Chas E. George mouthpiece very much, both for the plating issue and the fact that it just was not my size at all. But this is a little bit annoying, and there is a slight wobble, which tells me this lead pipe might be slightly bowed. Then, continuing down the lead pipe, we have our dual tuning slide setup. We've got two pieces there. This is fairly typical of the era. My 1924 King Liberty on the wall behind me has the very same thing. And this is how you get that invisible quick change to the key of A. When you pull this, it'll stop at this point thanks to these rings retaining the slide from extending any further. And that, times 2, is the proper amount of pull to lower a B-flat pitched instrument down to A. So that's your invisible quick change. Then if you want to play in C, what you have to do is actually unscrew these rings, and that'll allow the middle extension section to come off. Then we remove this middle piece here, and we stick the tuning crook back on, and that shortens the instrument by a whole step. Now the pitfall of this is of course that the valve tuning slides cannot be shortened appropriately, especially this third valve slide, which was designed quite long for a minor third, so you wouldn't have to extend as much on your low D and C sharp. This is way out of tune when you try and play in the key of C, as are the other two valve slides, if not a little bit more minorly. Our valves have some very pretty caps and trim here, and they're numbered 1, 2, 3, as one would expect. These casings are really pretty, by the way. I'm gonna unscrew this valve here so we can take a look inside. And it looks quite similar to a modern valve, honestly. It's got the serial number stamped on it, and all of them do match the serial number that is stamped on the outside of the casing. We've got some fancy pull nubs on the slides. We have some interesting features here on the third slide that also make this fairly unusual compared to the ones in the book. First things first, we have this underslung reverse design. This is the reverse of what we normally see on trumpets today, but it was also different from what we would typically see back then, where these outer tubes would be the same length. Whether the outer tubes stopped here or here, it didn't really make a difference. Usually it was the same top and bottom, especially because we've got that lyre holder soldered in, and it can only be soldered to the bottom tube as a result. This is pretty unusual for its time. We'll note a few things here: an adjustable ring and a dump slide, although the dump slide is currently stuck. A nice little plate there for bracing and for, I would assume, aesthetics. It looks quite nice. And like I mentioned, this is quite a tight trumpet. It's got a 1 on the valve casing, meaning it's a small bore at the valve section. Now, I didn't find any literature stating exactly what that measurement would be, so we'll have to make some educated guesses here. My King Liberty was considered a medium bore, and it was 450 thousandths of an inch, or 0.450. Modern trumpets that are medium larges are typically 458 to 460, so 450 sounds about right as a medium bore. Some of my favorite horns, like the Yamaha Bobby Shoe and the Yamaha 732, the Schilke B6 and B7, they are medium bores of the valve section, and that is 445. So my best guess is that the small bore here would be somewhere in the upper 430s, maybe as small as 432. I can't really see it being any smaller than that, but likely 436 to 438. That's my best guess. Hopefully somebody can correct me or affirm that in the comments. And then we have quite a tight bell throat here, all the way, it's not quite a pea shooter bell, but it's relatively tight, all the way to that 4.5 or 4 7/16 flare. And what I should note there is that this is not quite a pea shooter trumpet, like I said. The typical pea shooters of the early 1900s had even smaller bells, tighter wraps, vertically speaking, like it was hard to get your hand in there. And generally, this is just a little bit too much bell throat, I think, for your typical pea shooter. This is only about halfway to that point. Now, before selling this thing, I decided to take it to at least one gig with me so that I could have some decent impressions of how it does in an ensemble setting. The Masterclass Big Band was doing an outdoor barbecue performance, and so I showed up with this horn and decided to put it through its paces. I was mostly stuck playing fourth that day, but I did a little bit of lead and a little bit of soloing, and mostly lower chair work. And this horn was actually a lot of fun. I really enjoy the penetrating quality of its sound, even though that's not usually my mental sound concept, particularly if I'm playing on my own. And while it didn't blend perfectly with the section, it did a decent job for a horn of this tight geometry from 100 years ago compared to modern horns. And what's more is it had a really nice lead sound sitting atop the section. I did, a little bit of screaming just for a few tunes, and honestly, this is an A-grade screamer. It actually does really well up there, and you know me, I play on a Yamaha shoe. I am pampered in the upper register, so for me to be this impressed with a horn is pretty good. Unfortunately, in the solo samples you're going to hear, my chops are not all there, but it does scream nicely. Trust me, I just am not having a good chop day. And moreover, the one drawback, and the reason I started liking it a little bit less as the gig wore on, especially as we got to the second set, is the fact that these tighter horns, they can be overblown. I mentioned that my shoe is a medium bore at the valve section, but it has ways to compensate greatly for that. For instance, there being a step bore where the lead pipe actually expands out to a much larger diameter, and the fact that the bell throat is quite large and the bell ends in a full 5-inch flare. When I play on something this tight, it definitely is a very different experience. I can lean against the resistance of the horn, but on the other hand, it's a less stable wall of resistance. I feel like I can push the wall over a little bit too easily, and then I start overblowing, kind of getting a nasty spread out sort of sound. And the same is true for the higher register. I really liked screaming on this for the first part of the gig, but then later on my high notes were not speaking well. That's partly just my endurance not being very good these days, but it's also the fact that the sort of impedance profile, if you will, of this instrument is quite different from that of a modern one. Now, a big part of the reason why I ever bothered with horns like this or the King Liberty back there is for the solo tone. I am a big enjoyer of trumpet players like Harry James from the era where trumpet sound was a little bit more tight and thin and penetrating and harsh, if you will. Even, the best, most melodic players of the time, whether due to the instrument or the approach or the recording setup of the time, which certainly could make a difference, the sound comes off in that sort of more edgy sense, and I wanted to see if these sorts of horns would do that for me. And so I like to test this out with a relatively shallow mouthpiece. We're still talking about a 1.5C here, nothing too ridiculous, but I like to test out Harry James excerpts on instruments like this, and I think this one does pretty well for that task. I would say the tone is slightly more pea shooter in nature than that of the Liberty. Not hugely. I'd say the Liberty's about 40% of a pea shooter and this is 50 or 60. It is brighter, it is thinner, but it's still fairly manageable, and it can honestly still lean dark with a deeper mouthpiece. But of course the darkness we're talking about in this case is very much not the modern, thick, broad darkness, but rather just a slight lack of focus, unfortunately. And that was also very much the case when I tested the George mouthpiece that was in the case. I really only played on it for a couple minutes and I was not having a good time, but The sound definitely darkened a bit what was also lacking focus and definition, which, in my opinion, would kind of defeat the purpose of an instrument like this. And of course, I am a huge nut for anything that can change keys, so I did test out the quick change mechanism. I played the same excerpt in all 3-ish keys that this horn offers. And in A, as long as you pull the first and second slide, it is acceptable. It does a decent job. It feels a little strange. Some of the slots live in funny places because of what happens when you introduce that much of a bore gap into the instrument, where now you just have the outer tube and then you step down into the inner tube. That does some funny things to the upper register slots, but it did okay. But this thing is definitely not your next orchestral C trumpet. I mentioned that the valve slides are tuned to B flat length, except for the third, which is like A or A flat length. It is just overly long. And when you try and take out that midsection of the tuning slide and put it back in for the key of C, your open partial series is fine. But say goodbye to using the third valve on its own, certainly. And even just about everything on valves 1 and 2 is bordering on intolerable, if I'm honest. You'll note, specifically about this fingering, that if you play an open G and then the pitch goes down when you press 1 and 3, your valve slides are really flat. And when I got down to a D on 1 and 3, it was definitely, at the very least, in tune and possibly flat. So that tells you just how much longer these valve slides are than would be necessary for the key of C. But I don't think this was ever meant to be a serious C trumpet. I think it was just meant to have the feature in case, let's say, a church player wants to play out of his hymn book and doesn't want to transpose. And at the time, in the 1920s, this would have been adequate for the job. And that'll just about conclude my review of and my time with the Boston Model 11 3-star small bore trumpet. This is a really fun instrument, but unfortunately there's only one of me and only so many horns I can play on the regular, and this pristine piece of history deserves to go to somebody who will appreciate it more regularly than I can. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, we got lots more vintage stuff coming out, so make sure you are subscribed to the channel, unlike the vast majority of my audience there. It's a small gesture with a huge impact on the channel as we keep making videos, and it'll keep you up to date as we release more reviews of vintage and other instruments. For the time being, if you want to see more reviews and show and tells and whatnot, you can go to the review playlist in the top right corner in the card. But as for this video, if you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and a comment. Once again, thanks for joining me on this wild ride as we discussed and demoed this 101-year-old piece of history. And until next time, we'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.